It was a quiet afternoon when Sandra Bullock strolled down a peaceful city street, hoping to find a nice place to grab a cup of coffee. Dressed casually in jeans, sneakers, and a loose hoodie, she blended in with the crowd, making her way toward a small but elegant cafe. She had heard great things about this place from friends, how it was a cozy spot with a great atmosphere and top-notch coffee. As she reached the cafe entrance, she could already smell the rich aroma of freshly brewed espresso. A smile formed on her lips as she stepped inside, looking forward to unwinding for a bit. However, the moment she entered, she immediately noticed a shift in energy. A waiter, dressed in a crisp uniform, approached her, his expression stiff and disapproving. He looked her up and down, his eyes narrowing slightly as he assessed her casual attire. It was clear that he wasn't pleased with her presence. "Excuse me, ma'am," the waiter said in a cold, clipped tone. "We have a strict dress code. We only serve VIP guests, and I'm afraid we can't accommodate you today." Sandra raised an eyebrow, slightly amused. She wasn't one to expect special treatment, but she also wasn't used to being turned away so rudely. "I just wanted a cup of coffee," she said simply, keeping her voice calm. The waiter gave a condescending smirk. "This establishment caters to a certain clientele," he said, subtly glancing at the elegantly dressed patrons seated inside. "Perhaps you'd feel more comfortable at a coffee shop down the street." Sandra chuckled softly, shaking her head. She had experienced situations like this before, being judged based on appearances rather than who she really was. She wasn't upset, just disappointed. "Are you sure about that?" she asked, her voice holding a hint of challenge. "I'm sure," the waiter responded without hesitation. "Now, I'll have to ask you to leave." With a small sigh, Sandra turned around and walked out. However, what neither the waiter nor the other staff knew was that Keanu Reeves, the owner of the cafe, had just walked in. And he had seen the entire exchange. Things were about to change. Keanu Reeves had been standing just outside the cafe, watching the entire scene unfold. Dressed in his usual understated style, black jeans, a t-shirt, and a jacket, he didn't look like a celebrity or a business owner. He just looked like another customer. But what he had just witnessed didn't sit well with him. As Sandra Bullock walked away, shaking her head with a small smirk on her lips, Keanu took a deep breath and stepped inside. The same waiter who had just turned Sandra away was now standing at the entrance, checking out the next customers with a critical eye. Keanu walked up to him, his expression unreadable. "Excuse me," he said in his calm, deep voice. The waiter barely looked at him. "Sir, do you have a reservation?" Keanu tilted his head slightly. "I think I do," he replied. "But first, I'd like to ask you something." The waiter finally looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Yes." Keanu crossed his arms. "I just saw you turn away a customer. A woman who just wanted a cup of coffee. You told her this cafe is for VIPs only. Is that true?" The waiter, sensing some tension, straightened his posture. "Yes, sir. We have high standards here. We cater to a specific clientele, celebrities, business executives, high-profile guests. We can't just let anyone walk in." Keanu's lips pressed into a thin line, his patience being tested. "And what if I told you that woman you turned away is one of the biggest celebrities in Hollywood?" The waiter scoffed, clearly not believing him. "Oh, really? And who would that be?" Keanu leaned in slightly. "Sandra Bullock." The waiter blinked, his face losing some of its arrogance. "Wait, Sandra Bullock?" Keanu nodded. "The very one. And not only did you turn her away, but you were incredibly rude about it." The waiter suddenly looked nervous. His confidence wavered as he realized his mistake. I didn't recognize her," he stammered. Keanu sighed, shaking his head. "That's the problem," he said. "You're judging people based on how they look rather than how they should be treated." Then, Keanu dropped the final bombshell. "And by the way, I own this place." The waiter's face turned pale. And this was only the beginning of his reckoning. The waiter's face went pale as Keanu's words sank in. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The cafe was quiet now, with other customers beginning to take notice of the exchange. "You own this place?" The waiter finally stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Keanu nodded, his gaze steady. "Yes, I do. And right now, I'm questioning how someone like you ended up representing my establishment." The waiter swallowed hard. He could feel the judgmental stares of other employees and patrons around him. Just moments ago, he had been the gatekeeper of this so-called VIP cafe, turning away a customer he deemed unworthy. Now, he realized he had made a mistake that could cost him everything. "I didn't know, Mr. Reeves," the waiter said quickly, his tone desperate. I was just following policy. We have to keep the standards high." Keanu crossed his arms, unimpressed. "Let me ask you something. Do you think being a VIP is about expensive suits and designer bags?" The waiter hesitated, not knowing how to answer. I just thought." Keanu cut him off. "A true VIP isn't about wealth or fame. It's about how you treat people. And you just insulted one of the most talented, hardworking, and kind people I know." The waiter's eyes darted toward the door, as if hoping Sandra Bullock was still standing outside, waiting for a second chance to be served. But she was gone. The other employees of the cafe had now gathered, watching in stunned silence. One of them, a young barista, finally spoke up. "Mr. Reeves, we didn't know you were here today." Keanu exhaled sharply. "That's the point. You shouldn't act differently just because I'm here. You should treat every customer with the same respect and kindness, no matter who they are." The waiter dropped his gaze, his arrogance now completely stripped away. I'm really sorry," he mumbled. "I didn't mean to offend her." Keanu stared at him for a long moment before shaking his head. "It's not me you should be apologizing to." The weight of those words hung in the air. The waiter knew what he had to do. But would Sandra Bullock even give him the chance? The weight of Keanu's words lingered in the air, pressing down on the waiter like a heavy burden. His arrogance had crumbled, replaced by a sinking realization. He had insulted someone who not only deserved respect but had every right to be in the cafe just like anyone else. Keanu sighed, rubbing the back of his neck before looking at the young barista. "Is she still outside?" The barista quickly nodded. "I think she's just across the street, Mr. Reeves." She looked upset. Without another word, Keanu turned and strode toward the door. The entire cafe watched in silence as the waiter hesitated before hurrying after him, knowing he had no choice but to make things right. Outside, Sandra Bullock stood by a small bookstore, her arms crossed, staring at the street as if lost in thought. She had no idea what had just happened inside the cafe. When she heard footsteps approaching, she turned, her eyes widening slightly as she saw Keanu, and behind him, the waiter, his face filled with regret. "Sandra," Keanu said with a warm smile. "Mind coming back for a moment?" She raised an eyebrow. "Keanu, I appreciate it, but it's fine. I don't want to make a scene." Keanu glanced at the waiter, who was shifting uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. "Actually," Keanu said, "I think someone has something they'd like to say to you." Sandra looked at the waiter, her expression unreadable. He swallowed hard and finally met her gaze. "Ms. Bullock, I just wanted to say I'm really, truly sorry. I was rude, and I made assumptions I had no right to make. I had no idea who you were, but that's not even the point. I should never treat anyone like that." Sandra studied him for a moment, then let out a soft chuckle. "So, if I was wearing a fancy dress and dripping in jewelry, would you have let me in?" The waiter's face turned red. I was wrong," he admitted. "I judged you unfairly, and I regret it." Sandra exchanged a glance with Keanu, who gave her a small nod. Then she smiled. "Apology accepted, but I hope you've learned something from this." The waiter nodded sincerely. "I have." Keanu gestured toward the cafe. "So, coffee?" Sandra smirked. "Only if he serves me personally." The waiter gave a nervous chuckle. "It would be my honor." And with that, they all headed back inside. As Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves stepped back into the cafe, the atmosphere had completely shifted. The once judgmental eyes of customers and staff now held curiosity, embarrassment, and even admiration. The waiter, still visibly nervous, led Sandra to a prime table near the window, pulling out a chair for her. "Please, have a seat, Ms. Bullock," he said, his voice filled with genuine humility. Sandra chuckled, shaking her head as she sat. "I appreciate the effort, but just call me Sandra. And let's not make this awkward." Keanu took the seat across from her, watching as the waiter placed two menus in front of them. His hands were slightly shaky, but there was a clear determination in his actions. "I'd love to recommend our house special cappuccino," the waiter said, regaining a bit of confidence. "On the house, of course." Sandra smiled. "Only if you promise you'll treat every customer with the same respect, whether they're in a designer dress or an old hoodie." The waiter nodded immediately. "I swear, today was a wake-up call. I was judging people on the surface, and that's not who I want to be." Keanu leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "Good. Because real success, real class, isn't about money or looks. It's about how you treat people when you think no one is watching." The waiter swallowed hard, realizing that this moment would stick with him for the rest of his life. He nodded again. "Thank you, Mr. Reeves. Sandra. You've taught me something important today." As the waiter left to prepare their drinks, the cafe patrons murmured among themselves, some embarrassed that they had judged the situation so quickly, while others simply marveled at the scene they had just witnessed. Sandra looked at Keanu with a knowing smirk. "You really love these dramatic life lessons, don't you?" Keanu shrugged, his signature laid-back charm evident. "Hey, if it helps make the world a little kinder, why not?" Their drinks arrived, and as they sipped, the tension of the situation faded, replaced by laughter and good conversation. Outside, the sun shone a little brighter, and inside, a humbled waiter had just learned a lesson that would change him forever. And somewhere in the world, kindness had won, again.